Okay, so today we're going to continue on edge, okay, but we're also going to talk about line related to edge. The reason I have you shape your pencil a certain way, and the idea is to shape it like a wedge, is so that you can essentially rotate the pencil and continuously go from either a broad line to a very thin line to essentially any type of line you want without ever taking your pencil off the paper. Okay? And the gimmick is I sharpen it initially with a razor blade, and then I sand down a flat surface so that I can get the broad, I can go from this broad area, then by rotating it from the flat surface I get the broad area, then by rotating it 180 degrees, I essentially can just use the point to get very fine, hard, thin lines, or even very hard, broad lines. Now, if you notice in a lot of the past demonstrations, I never take the pencil off the paper. And that's, again, part of this technique. I'm actually rotating the pencil in my hand to essentially vary the line width as I move along and basically build the drawing. Okay? Now, that takes a little work. So, again, it's sort of an advanced technique. It just takes practice. You got to just practice moving the pencil around and trying not to essentially take it off the paper and break it up. So instead of doing a two-step thing in terms of basically putting, say, a broad line in and then picking it up off the paper and putting a thin line in, I actually just rotate it and make a continuous line. Okay. Now, last week we covered edge a little bit, where we talked about, remember S7, all right, shape, edge, value. So I'm going to expand on the edge part of that this week. The part that we covered last week was using edge to make shapes either advance or recede. So we talked about hard edges and soft edges. Okay, hard edges advance and soft edges recede. Now, edge is also important in human anatomy. Anytime I have a bony structure like my shoulder blade, my knees, my cheek, that'll give you normally would put that in as a hard edge on the drawing. Anytime I have flesh, basically you put that in as a soft edge. For example, let me just do a quick demo. Let me just do a straight standing figure. Okay, now let's assume this figure is a female. Now, as I build this up, I can actually vary the edge as I move along. So as I hit the shoulder, I put a hard edge in for the shoulder. I would rotate the pencil so I get soft edge for the flesh of the arm. When I hit the elbow, I put another hard edge in. The forearm might have a little more bone in it, so I'd have a slightly harder edge, and then I'd go to the hand. If this were a female, I'd put the breasts in. They would actually be essentially flesh, and be essentially you'd have a soft edge for the breasts. But if the breasts were casting a shadow, again we touched on this last week, the cast shadow would start with a very hard edge and then would slowly blur away as you basically got away from the object that was casting the shadow, which would be the breast. Okay, I could build this up a little more. I might see a hard edge near the hip bones. So I put the leg in. If I put the kneecap in, it would look like a small skull, but it would be basically bone, so I'd have some hard edges near the kneecap. Okay, so I've sort of added to the use of edges. Last week we talked about the edges in terms of having something advance or recede and foreshortening, and now I'm saying that we can actually use hard and soft edges in anatomy. Okay? Now let's take it a step further. Now, because this is a drawing course, I'm essentially talking about edges in terms of how you vary the line to either get a hard edge or a soft edge just by varying the line. But there's other ways you can get hard and soft edges. Well, you can actually get a hard edge or a soft edge with value. We covered value a couple weeks ago. And the idea is that if I have a very dark dark next to a very light light. So just with that contrast, I would get a hard edge at the division between the light and the dark. So I can actually get a hard edge with value if I want. I can make this edge soft by, again, shading in the light area so that now that the values are starting to approach each other. And of course, when they're actually the same value, the edge would disappear, unless I actually drew a hard line there. Okay, you can have what's known as lost or found edges, where the edge actually will vanish. For instance, if I have an intense light, if I was doing a portrait, and this is it, and I had an intense light on the person's face, and let's say the light was coming from above, from the left, but it was so intense that the light, just like in painting you could have an intense light would wipe out color, the intense light would actually wipe out the edge. So that where I normally would have a hard edge in the forehead, that could actually just be wiped out by the intensity of the light, essentially negating the edge by blurring it out because of the light being very, very intense. Similar thing, you can do a similar thing with shadow. That is, you can lose an edge in the shadow. That suppose the back of this person's head was, again, the light's coming from the left and from above, and there wasn't much reflected light in the room. That if this was, say, an open space, and the space in back of the head was fairly dark, I could actually lose, the hair would be sort of fluffy to start with, but I could actually lose essentially the edge of the hair because the value in back of the hair would be similar to the color of the hair, particularly if the hair was dark. So edges add another dimension to the drawing. One thing that I see all the time that I want you to be aware of and not do is never make a continuous edge. That is, you don't want all hard edges, you don't want all soft edges. What I see all the time is that people will outline a figure with a hard edge. They'll put the hard edge, I see this in painting and drawing all the time, they'll put the hard edge every place. So every shape on the outside edge will have a hard edge. That makes the figure look like a cutout that's pasted on the paper. You do not want to do that. What you try to do is you try to vary the edge. So even if I can't see hard and soft edges, what I would try to do would be, I basically put hard edges in strategic locations so that I'm trying to move your eye around. Hard edges will always attract your eye, so I'm trying to put the hard edges in strategic locations. For instance, I would see a hard edge under the rib, under the breast, where the rib cage might be sticking out. I might see a hard edge on the back here where the scapula is sticking out. But I would never, what I'm trying never to do is essentially have a continuous hard edge covering the entire drawing. Or what you don't want to do is have hard edges where they're totally symmetric. I have a hard edge here and put a hard edge here. I put a hard edge here and put a hard edge here. Okay, I don't want to do that. I want variety. I want your eye to move around. And typically I want your eye to end up at a focal point where the head, if you're going to have our hard edges, our big value differences, that's where you want to have it. You want to have it at the focal point, which is usually upper part of the body, but because of the way we have it lit, which is from the above and from the left. Okay, so before we go on, let me just give you a couple examples of completed drawings with edge work in them. Again, this is the same model, and there's two different poses, and there's two different situations with the edges. Okay? Now, again, you can see I have hard edges and soft edges. Her face is almost all soft edges because I wanted it to recede. It was a little bit away from the spotlight, was more on her upper torso. You notice I have a hard edges where her rib cage is sticking out, and again where the bone of her hip bone sticks out. I have hard edges on the leg that I want to come out, that's actually coming towards you. The back shoulder, again, the edges are much softer compared to the right shoulder. And again, I actually harden the edge even more because of the big value change here, in addition to having a hard line for the shoulder. On the lower one, same game. I have a few small hard edges on the back because I want that to recede, particularly where the scapula meets the rib cage, and here where you essentially have the hip bone, and again where the leg essentially connects with the upper part of the hip girdle. Again, the knees are hard edge, you see them coming out. I have a dark, broad hard edge under the legs to anchor the figure to the mat she's laying on. And you notice that again, for the cast shadow here, I start out with a hard edge. It starts out dark with a hard edge and slowly fuzzes away again to a very soft neutral. And again, the same with the cast shadows from the stool that she has her arms on. Again, notice I have a hard edge under this arm, but again, I don't have hard edges on the top arm because I don't want it to be symmetric. I just have a very small hard edge near where her forearm joins with her bicep. And again, the breast almost disappears because the shadow under the breast is essentially merging with the shadow that's being cast on the chair. So again, this is an idea of this is an example of a lost edge in the shadow. Again, this bright highlight on her shoulder would negate any structure you'd see if there would be some structure there from the bone, but it's basically negated by the brightness of that highlight. Okay, cut.